It's strange, really, how silence can speak louder than any insult. I still remember that afternoon the sun filtered softly through the kitchen blinds, casting warm rectangles across the table, and the roast was just beginning to cool. The clinking of cutlery echoed off the tiled walls as everyone took their place, except her, my niece. She stood behind the last chair, waiting, unsure if she was supposed to sit. Nobody told her to. Nobody offered. Not even me. And that more than anything is what stays with me. That moment, so quiet, so seemingly small, was the first time I saw her as a guest in my own home. A home that had once belonged to my parents, and then to me. A home where laughter once bounced freely off these same walls, and where now words hung like stale air. They didn't say much to her. She spoke softly, asking if she could help set the table, only to be waved off by my daughter-in-law with a clipped, "We're good, thanks." My niece smiled politely, but I saw her fingers twitch, uncertain, needing to be useful, needing to belong. I watched her sit finally in the one remaining chair. It wasn't at the table. It was pulled slightly back, squeezed between the wall and the sideboard. She perched there, eating with her plate balanced on her lap, and not a single person seemed to notice. Or maybe they did, and just didn't care. It wasn't always like this. There was a time when she was welcomed back when her parents died, and she came to live with me. She was 11, small, frightened, and clutching a plastic bag with all her belongings. She didn't cry much, but her silence was heavy. I gave her the room next to mine. She would peek in some nights, standing there, in her oversized nightshirt, whispering, "Can I sleep with you tonight?" And I always said yes. I never thought I was doing something grand. I was just doing what family should. But as the years went on and life shifted as my own children grew up and brought their families into this house, her place became blurred. To them, she was not sister or cousin. She was the girl who stayed. She became invisible in plain sight, not mistreated in the way people might assume, no shouts, no strikes, but in that slow, suffocating way of being constantly overlooked. I saw it, but I swallowed it, thinking maybe things would soften with time, that they'd come to see her as I did. Instead, the opposite happened. There was a day not long after that awkward dinner when I caught the grandchildren playing a game in the living room. They were assigning each other roles, mommy, daddy, baby. She asked if she could play too. One of them giggled and said, "You can be the maid." The others laughed. I stood there in the hallway, unable to move, and she smiled as if it were nothing, as if she didn't understand. But I knew she did. Her smile was just a way to stay included, a way to not make things harder. That was always her way, make herself smaller, quieter, more acceptable. I think about the meals I cooked and the birthdays I hosted, every cake frosted with effort, every gift chosen with care. And yet somehow, her presence became the thing that made others uncomfortable. She was polite. She worked hard. She never asked for anything. But that wasn't enough, was it? Because what they wanted wasn't gratitude. They wanted her absence. They wanted space. They wanted less. I once overheard someone say, "She eats like she owns the place." That sentence played in my mind over and over again, because I knew exactly who they meant. And it broke something in me, not because I believed it, but because I realized how far they'd gone to dehumanize her, eating like she owned the place. Imagine that an orphaned girl who's lived here since she was 11, being resented for chewing too confidently. I started to pay more attention after that, noticing how they never really looked at her when she spoke, how she was never asked to join in the planning of things, trips, parties, decisions, how her seat at the table kept moving farther and farther away. I wanted to believe it was just oversight. I wanted to believe it was unintentional. But I no longer do. And neither does she. There was a morning not too long ago when I found her sitting alone on the porch, a half-knitted scarf in her lap. The yarn had pooled beside her like a trail of thoughts she couldn't untangle. I asked her if she was cold. She looked up at me, smiled softly, and said, "No, I just like pretending I'm waiting for someone." That stayed with me. I didn't ask who. I didn't ask why. I just sat beside her and we watched the sky go from blue to gray. That was when I began to realize the worst kind of cruelty isn't loud. It's the kind that looks like politeness on the surface, but starves someone slowly day by day of dignity and belonging. They'd made her feel like a visitor in the only home she had left, and I had let it happen. Quietly, incrementally. I had allowed it all under the guise of keeping peace. But something was beginning to stir in me. A quiet revolt, a reckoning wrapped in reflection. I wasn't angry yet, not quite, but I was no longer blind. That was the beginning. The day she sat in the corner of her own family's table, with a plate in her lap, and no space made for her, that was the day I started writing a different story in my heart. A story they wouldn't see coming. It was supposed to be a small celebration. Nothing extravagant, just family and a simple meal. I had turned 74 that day, the kind of birthday that doesn't feel particularly significant to anyone, but still holds meaning, especially to someone like me, who's starting to count birthdays with a quiet reverence. I had baked the cake myself, chocolate, with a layer of coffee cream. My niece had helped me frost it, her hands careful and patient, the way she always was when she worked beside me. We laughed softly as we worked, our voices low in the early afternoon hush. The kitchen smelled of sugar and warmth, and for a fleeting moment it felt like it used to, before the house filled with judgment disguised as family. By 5 o'clock everyone had arrived. My son brought his children and his wife, who had taken to looking around my home like a critic assessing a house for sale. My daughter, who used to call me every other day when she needed help with her babies, arrived late, clutching a gift bag with the tag still attached. No one hugged me tightly. It was all air kisses and distracted glances at phones. But I told myself it was enough. I had learned over the years to reduce the size of my expectations. It was easier that way. We all sat down for dinner, and I noticed right away there was no extra place set for my niece. She stood in the kitchen doorway holding a tray of glasses, unsure if she should interrupt. My grandson, barely 10, looked up at her and asked, "Aren't you eating in the kitchen?" And just like that, everyone froze. My daughter-in-law laughed too quickly. "Kids say the funniest things," she said, avoiding my eyes. My niece smiled. She always smiled. "I'll eat later," she said quietly, turning back toward the kitchen, as if that had always been the plan. I wanted to stand. I wanted to say something, but I didn't, not yet. I watched her walk away and felt something settle deep inside me. A heavy, cold thing I hadn't felt in years. Not anger, shame. Shame that I had allowed this to become our norm. They carried on. The wine was poured. Jokes were told. My daughter's husband made a comment about me still baking at my age, as if it were some quaint, outdated hobby. "Maybe next year we'll just order in," he said, and they all laughed. I laughed too, but it felt like gravel in my throat. My niece stayed in the kitchen, slicing the cake, arranging the candles just right. She brought it out quietly after dinner, setting it gently in front of me without ceremony. Everyone clapped. My grandchildren sang half-heartedly. I closed my eyes and made a wish, but not the kind I used to make. I didn't wish for health or time. I wished for truth, for clarity, for the strength to stop pretending. Later that evening, after they'd gone, I stood at the sink washing dishes while my niece dried them. She didn't say anything about dinner. She didn't mention the boy's comment, or the fact that she ate alone by the back door. but I saw the tiredness in her face, not from labor, but from the weight of invisibility. And I saw my own reflection in the kitchen window, older, yes, but also complicit. "You know," I said softly, "when you came here, I told myself I'd protect you." She looked at me startled. Then she smiled genuinely for the first time that day. "You did," she whispered. But I hadn't. Not really. I had let them draw lines around her place in this house, and I hadn't erased them. I had let her shoulder the awkwardness, the discomfort, the role of outsider in a home she had grown up in, a home she had cared for, a home where she learned to braid her hair and cook her first pot of rice and press her school uniforms, a home where she watched me cry the night my husband died, and where she held my hand through more losses than I can count, and yet somehow to the others she remained disposable, an accessory of my generosity, a favor extended too long. The worst part was she knew it too. She had learned to carry herself carefully, to be helpful, but not intrusive, grateful, but not entitled. She had learned to fade into the corners so they wouldn't push her out entirely. She made herself useful, more useful than any of them, and still it wasn't enough to be treated like family. That night after she went to bed, I sat at the dining table with the leftover cake, a single slice on my plate. I didn't eat it. I just looked at it. It was beautiful, perfectly cut, the frosting smooth. She had done that. I traced the edge with my fork and thought about all the things I hadn't said, all the silences I had let pass, all the moments when I could have spoken, could have drawn a line, but didn't. And somewhere in that stillness, I realized something. The damage wasn't just in their cruelty. It was in my silence. Every time I stayed quiet to avoid confrontation, I was siding with the louder voices. Every time I let it go for the sake of peace, I was choosing comfort over justice. I was choosing them over her, and I couldn't keep doing that. So I made a new wish that night, a birthday promise to myself. I would stop watching. I would stop apologizing for loving her. And most of all, I would stop rewarding cruelty with inheritance. There's something achingly symbolic about leftovers. They're what remains when everyone else has had their fill, what's deemed unnecessary surplus forgotten. And for years, that's what she got. Not in the dramatic, obvious ways that people might imagine, but in the quiet, subtle rituals that add up to something far worse. A second helping of silence. A plate made up of whatever didn't matter enough to be claimed first. She never complained, not once. She always waited until everyone had taken their portion. If there was chicken, she'd pick from the pieces no one else wanted: wings, cartilage bones with barely any meat. If there were spring rolls, she'd take the broken ones. If the rice ran low, she'd scoop what stuck to the bottom of the pot. And she'd smile while doing it. That same weary, careful smile. I used to tell myself she didn't mind, that she had pride in being resourceful. But I see now what it truly was. She had simply learned to accept being last. It's strange how often the family praised her for being so humble. They'd say it as though it were a compliment, as though her invisibility made things easier for them to bear. "She's so low maintenance," my daughter once said with a laugh. "She'll eat anything." As though that were a virtue, as though it absolved them of ever having to consider her hunger. One afternoon stands out an ordinary Tuesday. I'd made noodle soup her favorite. She and I had eaten together many times when it was just us in the house. We'd sit on the balcony with bowls warming our hands, talking about everything and nothing. But that day my daughter-in-law had dropped by, unannounced, with her children. By the time I got back to the kitchen, they'd helped themselves. The pot was nearly empty, only broth left swirling at the bottom. My niece came in as I was washing up. "Don't worry," she said, her voice light. "I'll just have a bit of the broth." I like it better that way." I handed her the ladle with trembling fingers. She poured the watery remains into a chipped bowl, sat on a stool by the door, and sipped quietly. It was summer, but I felt a chill run through me. That bowl wasn't soup. It was a symbol of how easily the world had come to believe she needed less. And the irony, she gave more than any of them. When my hip started acting up, it was she who noticed. Before I even said a word, she brought me warm towels, rubbed ointment into my skin, adjusted my chair when I tried to sit. When the kitchen sink began to leak, she patched it temporarily with old cloths until I could get someone to fix it. She hung the laundry, cleaned the windows, restocked the pantry, all without ever being asked. Her care was constant, seamless, invisible, like breath, like time. And like so many essential things, it was taken completely for granted. They never offered her anything. Not a day off, not a thank you, not a seat at the head of the table. They just expected her to be there, available, useful, quiet. The very things that made her lovable to me seemed to make her expendable to them. I started noticing how leftovers were not just on plates, but in the way they spoke about her. "She's still here. Has she found a job yet? You're still supporting her." Questions dressed up as concern, but really just excuses to express irritation. I wondered sometimes if they realized she could hear. Maybe they didn't care. Or maybe they believed that kindness could be optional if someone didn't contribute. I thought of the times I'd heard them talking about her like a cost. "She's another mouth to feed." The phrase echoed through me like thunder. Another mouth, as if she were some statistic in a budget sheet, not a person who had helped me through widowhood, illness, aging. Not someone who gave her entire youth to making this house feel less empty. No, just a mouth, an expense. But how do you put a value on comfort, on loyalty, on presence? It wasn't just about meals. It was about memory, about meaning. Every time they treated her like an afterthought, they chipped away at the history we had built together. They erased the years when she helped me hang curtains, when we painted the living room, when she brought me tea after my doctor appointments. They made her small so they could feel bigger, and I had let them. There was a moment, I remember it so vividly, when she placed a bowl of rice in front of me one evening, and I noticed her hand trembling. "You're tired," I said, reaching for her wrist. She looked startled, almost embarrassed, and nodded. "I'll rest after the dishes," she whispered. And something snapped inside me. She was not here to serve them. She was not here to be the house's unpaid ghost. She was here because I loved her, because I chose her. Because when everyone else saw an inconvenience, I saw my own second chance at family. And it was time they understood that love is not based on who brings what to the table, but on who stays when the table is empty. From that night on, I began taking mental notes of every slight, every exclusion, every little moment they hoped would go unnoticed. And I held them close not in bitterness, but in preparation. I had been told my whole life that elders should be wise, not reactive, that our strength is in our silence. But what good is wisdom if it just watches wrong unfold? She wasn't a leftover. She was the first person who deserved more. Winter has a way of making truth more visible. The cold strips everything down. People's patience wears thinner silences, grow louder, and the smallest kindness becomes monumental. That winter years ago, when she was still just a child, and I was only beginning to understand what raising her would truly mean, was the first time I realized how little the world gives to those who don't demand anything, and how deeply she had already learned not to ask. The old radiator in the hallway had gone out again. The plumber said he could come the following week, but in the meantime we made do with extra layers thicker socks and a space heater in my bedroom. I gave her the warmest blanket I owned, a thick woolen thing my mother had passed down. But when I woke up in the middle of the night to check on her, I found her curled up on the floor next to my bed, the blanket wrapped around both of us. She'd brought her pillow and quietly made a nest beside me like a little animal, seeking warmth, not wanting to disturb anyone, not wanting to ask for space in my bed. She had covered me first. That was what undid me. The blanket was pulled higher over me than it was over her. She had made sure I was warm before she even thought of herself. I carried that moment with me for years, not because of its sweetness, though it was sweet, but because of what it revealed. Even then, she had already internalized a truth. The rest of the family hadn't even begun to reckon with. She would only be allowed to stay if she didn't take up too much space. It became her pattern. She never hogged the couch. She never took the best towel. She waited until others had left the room before she cried. Her life was composed around everyone else's comfort, and in return, they barely acknowledged her. I once overheard my son say to his wife, "She's lucky Mom took her in. Most people would have sent her to the state." And I remember how that sentence made me grip the edge of the kitchen counter. Not because he was wrong about the world's cruelty, but because he was blind to the cruelty right here under our roof. He didn't see her as one of us. Not truly. To him, she was an act of charity, something I had carried too long and too far. But I hadn't carried her. She had carried me. After my husband died, I stopped laughing. I went through the motions, grocery shopping, tidying, folding clothes, but it was like living underwater. Everything muted, everything slow. And it was her barely 16 who coaxed me back, who made me tea each morning and hummed while washing dishes just loud enough for me to hear, who filled the house with gentle noise when I couldn't bear my own thoughts. She brought life back into the walls, and not once did she ask for credit. It makes me think of that blanket we shared, how it smelled of lavender and old wood, how it scratched a little, but was thick and dependable. It wasn't pretty, but it kept us warm, just like her. She wasn't flashy. She didn't post pictures or seek praise, but she was there, every time I needed her, every time the house felt too empty or the silence too loud. And yet somehow the others acted as if she were taking something from them, as if love was a pie with only so many slices, and by giving her one, I was depriving them of theirs. But love doesn't work that way. Devotion doesn't divide. It multiplies. Only the insecure believe otherwise. A few winters ago, when I caught the flu, it was she who stayed up all night with me wiping my forehead, changing the bed sheets when I was too ill to move. And later, when I was better, she never even mentioned it. No retelling of her sacrifice. No need to be applauded. She just went back to folding the laundry like it was any other Tuesday. I think that's what hurts me most, that the family saw her quiet as weakness, that they mistook her goodness for passivity. They never stopped to notice the depth of her heart, because they were too busy measuring her worth by the wrong yardsticks, money status, bloodline. But I measured her by how she held that blanket between us, by how she made a space for me to heal when no one else even thought to ask if I was breaking. Years later, when the heater finally gave out for good and we had to install a new one, she was the one who called the repairman, negotiated the price, made him tea while he worked. She stood beside me like a daughter would like family does. And yet at dinner that night, my son joked, maybe she should start paying rent if she's going to manage the house. And they laughed, as if she hadn't just saved us hundreds, as if she were just still here, like a shadow they couldn't shake. But I no longer laughed with them, because I remembered the blanket. I remembered the warmth. I remembered who held me through the coldest years of my life. And I began to wonder if love is measured not in blood, but in presence. Then why was I rewarding absence with inheritance? Kindness, when freely given, is often mistaken for weakness. I've lived long enough to know this bitter truth. The world doesn't always reward gentleness. It learns to take from it silently, without thanks. My niece was kind endlessly so in a way that was woven into her being, not worn on the outside like a badge. She never offered help to gain favor. She offered because that's who she was. And because of that, they believed they could walk past her again and again without consequence. I remember the early days after she moved in. The family praised me for taking her in. "You're a saint," my daughter had said. "Most people wouldn't do what you've done." I nodded, smiled faintly. I wasn't doing it for praise. I was doing it because it was the right thing to do. But even then, I sensed something strange in their voices, like they thought I'd done my good deed, and now she should be grateful for life. Like her very existence here was a favor she'd never finish repaying. At first they acted supportive. My son even gave her an old laptop. My daughter bought her a used jacket, once handed it to her, like a charitable act. But over time, these small gestures became the currency they used to justify every coldness that followed, as if kindness once given exempted them from ever needing to offer more, as if their past gestures gave them permanent moral credit. And slowly their language changed. From "she's lucky to be here" to "how long is she planning to stay?" From "she's doing well" to "is she even trying to get her life together?" No one asked her what she needed. No one asked what she was healing from. They only measured what she contributed, and always found it lacking. Not because she didn't give, but because they weren't looking at the kind of giving that counts. She cooked meals. She ran errands. She helped the children with homework when their parents couldn't be bothered. She drove me to appointments. She kept track of my medication schedule. But those acts weren't celebrated. They were expected like housework assigned to someone beneath the rest. There was a particular moment I can't forget. We were preparing for Lunar New Year, and I'd asked her to help decorate the ancestral altar. She was careful, reverent. She took her time cleaning each object, polishing the brass, replacing the offerings. When my daughter arrived, she walked in, looked at the altar, and said, "You let her touch that." I turned to her, stunned. "She's not family," she added, as if it were obvious. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. My niece kept her eyes down and said nothing. She lit the incense anyway. Her hands didn't tremble, but mine did. And it was in that moment that something in me cracked, not with rage, but with grief. Grief for the years I had allowed her to be treated like a live-in shadow. Grief for every time I'd swallowed the urge to defend her, just to keep the peace. Grief for the truth. I could no longer deny my family had drawn a line in the sand, and she was always on the outside of it. I began to see things differently after that. The gifts they once praised me for, like housing her, feeding her, were now used against me. "You're too soft," my son said one evening. "You've spoiled her. She doesn't even try anymore." I looked at him, this grown man who'd never gone without, never once washed his own sheets, and I thought of how many times my niece had risen quietly at dawn to prepare breakfast for the whole household. What exactly did they think she was failing at? Was it because she hadn't married? Because she wasn't working a flashy job? Because she didn't wear makeup and take selfies and chase attention? To them, a woman was only valuable if she produced or performed. But what she offered, presence, loyalty, selflessness, those things don't fit into resumes or bank statements. They live in the quiet. They breathe in the shadows. And they are so easy to overlook. But I didn't overlook them anymore. I thought of the time she sat with me when I couldn't sleep, telling me old stories from her childhood just to make me laugh. I thought of how she offered to sew my curtain hems by hand when the machine broke. I thought of her setting the table every evening, folding napkins even when no one noticed. And I asked myself, if these acts aren't enough to earn love, then what kind of love is this house even built on? They expected her to fade, to remain grateful, to not ask for more, and maybe she never would. But I would. I would ask on her behalf. I would reckon with what they had done and what I had allowed. Because kindness does have a price, not for the one who gives it, but for those who keep taking. Eventually someone notices. Eventually someone stops. And I was done letting them pretend they didn't see the debt they owed her. So I opened my drawer that night, pulled out the folder labeled Estate Planning, and began to read through the documents I hadn't touched in years. I looked at the names. I thought of the laughter that never reached her, the plates never set for her, the birthdays never celebrated, with more than an afterthought. And I knew what I had to do. Not to punish, but to correct. Not out of vengeance, but out of justice. Because kindness should never be a curse. And in this house, hers would no longer be treated like one. We were sitting in a little family-owned restaurant tucked off a quiet street. Nothing fancy, just warm bowls of pho and the hum of conversation in the air. I had suggested it because it reminded me of when I was young, when my parents would take me out once a year to eat noodles on my birthday. It had become a small tradition of mine. Once every few months, I'd take whoever was available to a place like that. A small outing, a meal to break the monotony of reheated leftovers and half-listened conversations. This time I invited my son's family, my daughter, the grandkids, and of course her, my niece. She had dressed neatly, hair combed, hands folded in her lap, as we waited for the food. She didn't order much, just a small bowl and iced tea. She always chose the least expensive thing on the menu as though her hunger had to negotiate for permission. I wanted her to order more. I wanted her to know she could have what she liked, but she never did. Not around them. The food came, and the conversation floated around us like steam from the bowls, loose and half-engaged, full of anecdotes about work, complaints about school, little barbed comments passed between spouses. I watched her nod along, offering smiles, where needed quiet as ever. And then came the bill. The waitress placed the little tray in front of me, and I reached into my bag. But before I could touch my wallet, my son leaned over, took the receipt, and started scanning it. "Let's split it," he said, glancing around the table. "We'll just divide by head." A pause. And then his wife added casually, "Well, accept her right. She's not working. She can pay next time." It was a flick of a sentence, quick, dismissive, but it hit like cold water to the face. My niece's hand froze halfway to her glass. She looked at me for half a second, just a flick of the eyes and then down again. "I can cover mine," she said so softly it was almost a whisper. "No," I said louder than I meant to. "You don't have to do that." But my daughter was already waving it off. "It's fine, Mom. Really. We're not trying to make a big deal. Just being fair." Fair. What an ugly word when it's used as a weapon. Fair when she had cooked them meals without being asked. Fair when she watched their kids while they ran errands without pay or even a thank you text. Fair when she stayed home from outings so there'd be one less plate to serve. Fair when she folded their laundry when it got mixed in with mine. Fair. I paid the entire bill that day, slid my card under the receipt and said nothing more. But something inside me was beginning to harden, not into anger, not yet, but into certainty. Certainty that these people, my own children, had confused generosity with obligation, that they thought kindness was something they could quantify, add up, and subtract from whenever it suited them. that they had learned to measure value only in what was visible, spendable, or branded with a title. She never mentioned the incident again. That was her way, letting things roll off like rain on tile. But I noticed she stopped coming with us after that. If I asked her to join a meal, she'd smile and say, "You go. I'll have something here later." And I let her, because I didn't know how to fix what they'd broken. Later that night, after everyone had gone, she brought me a small plate of fruit, peeled and arranged, just the way I liked it. She didn't say anything about the restaurant, didn't ask how I felt, just handed me the plate with that same soft smile. I took it from her, and for the first time I reached for her wrist gently. "I saw what happened," I said. She didn't look up. "It's okay." "No," I said. "It's not." She gave a little nod, the kind that means I know, but I don't want to make it worse. I wanted to take that weight off her back, to undo all the years that had taught her to survive this way. But I couldn't. All I could do was decide that it wouldn't happen again. Not on my watch. And that's when I knew it wouldn't be enough to scold them or sit them down for a lecture. That kind of talk would vanish the moment I was gone. They would smile, nod, and return to their old ways the minute my voice wasn't there to interrupt them. No, what was needed wasn't words. It was structure. A change so final, so undeniable, they'd have no choice but to understand. That was the night I pulled out the first draft of my will. I hadn't looked at it in over a decade. It was still in the drawer beneath my winter scarves, wrapped in a plastic sleeve. I laid it out on the table, put on my reading glasses, and read it through word by word. And when I saw their names stacked neatly in ink, the neat little divisions of property and possessions, I felt nothing. They didn't need more things. They needed a lesson. And she, my quiet girl, my shadow with calloused hands, and an ocean of love, she needed recognition. Not a favor, not a portion, but a statement. A declaration of truth written in language they understood. Inheritance. Because if they insisted on measuring worth in money, I would show them who had truly earned it. I never meant to eavesdrop. I was coming down the hallway with a basket of folded towels in my arms when I heard them, my son and his wife, talking in the guest room. The door was slightly ajar, the way it always was when they thought no one else was around. At first I told myself to keep walking, to respect their privacy. But something in their tone stopped me sharp, clipped, full of irritation. It wasn't a conversation. It was a judgment being passed. "She's still here," my daughter-in-law said. "It's been over a decade, and she's not even family." "She's Mom's problem," my son replied, not angrily, just flat, like stating the obvious. "But yeah, I don't get why she's still living there, rent-free." My breath caught, but my feet stayed planted. The towels pressed up against my chest like armor, but they couldn't muffle the words that followed. "She's not a kid anymore. She's a grown woman, for God's sake. If she can't contribute, maybe it's time to say something." "And risk a fight with Mom? No thanks," he said. "Besides, she won't do anything. She's too soft." Too soft. The phrase landed like a stone in my stomach. I stepped back slowly, careful not to make the floorboards creak. I didn't want them to know I'd heard. I didn't want her to know either, not yet. I returned to my room, sat on the edge of the bed, with the towel still clutched in my arms, and stared at the floor. Too soft. That's what they thought of me, that I would tolerate anything, accept anything, allow them to devalue someone I loved, just to avoid confrontation. And in a way, they weren't wrong. I had been quiet. I had hoped things would change on their own. I had chosen to absorb the tension so that she wouldn't have to, but every soft choice had hardened into this, their comfort, built atop her displacement. I began to replay every small moment, now stained with the truth of what I had heard, The times they refused to set an extra place at dinner unless I insisted. The trips where they forgot to invite her. The way my son never addressed her directly, always speaking around her as though she were an extension of me and not her own person. I thought about the nights I heard her crying softly in the bathroom, thinking the fan would drown it out. I thought of her brushing the children's hair while their mother scrolled through her phone, offering no thanks, not even a glance. I thought of the way she lingered in doorways, always waiting to be told she was welcome. And suddenly I saw the pattern, not just their neglect, but mine. My silence had protected their egos, not her heart. I remembered one evening in particular. We had been sitting on the porch, the sunset casting gold through the trees. She turned to me and said, "Do you think they'll ever see me differently?" I didn't know what to say. So I just said, "They'll come around." But she had smiled in that tired way of hers, like someone who'd stopped believing, but didn't want to hurt me with the truth. Now I understood. She had known for years. She had endured it, not out of weakness, but out of love for me. She hadn't wanted to make things difficult. She thought bearing their coldness was a way of protecting me from drama, from conflict. But I didn't want her protection anymore. I wanted justice. That night I found her in the kitchen rinsing rice for the next day's meal. Her hands moved automatically, gracefully, as if this small ritual had become part of her bones. I leaned against the doorframe and watched her for a moment. "You don't have to do that," I said gently. She looked over her shoulder, confused. "Do what?" "All of it," I replied. "Taking care of things that don't take care of you." She turned off the tap and faced me fully. There was no smile, not this time, just silence. Her eyes searched mine for something, permission perhaps, or understanding. And for once I gave her both. "You're not a burden," I said. "They don't see you because they don't want to, but I do." She didn't cry. She simply nodded and went back to washing the rice. But I cried, not in front of her, later in my room, quietly as I lay in bed, with the will open in front of me. I ran my fingers over the names written in that firm legal script, each one placed carefully like chess pieces on a board, and I realized I didn't owe them anything. They had spent years taking her for granted, years treating her like an afterthought, years assuming my love would shield them from the cost of their disrespect. But love, I've learned, is not infinite when it is unreciprocated. It may bend for a while, but eventually it breaks. The next morning I called the lawyer. The hands that shaped my later years were not my children's. They were hers, small, steady, worn smooth, by endless tasks no one remembered assigning. I used to watch her quietly, the way she folded napkins with exact corners, how she could untangle the necklace I thought was beyond saving, how her fingers stitched the loose hem of my dress without even needing a thimble. Hands like that do not belong to a burden. They belong to someone who sees love not as a word but as work. She never asked for praise, but I noticed everything. The way she'd rearranged the medicine bottles on my bedside table so the labels all faced the same way. The way she rewrote grocery lists in neater handwriting so I wouldn't struggle to read them. The way she always left a glass of water by the kettle before going to bed so I wouldn't have to reach too far in the morning. Quiet things, things the others never saw because they never needed to. My daughter once came over and asked where the ironed sheets were. I said, "She just folded them yesterday," meaning my niece. My daughter frowned and muttered she's still doing all that, like it was strange, like care should expire after a certain age. I wanted to ask her, who else do you think does it? But I didn't. I let the question hang in the air unanswered because deep down I knew she wouldn't like the answer. Because the truth is comfort makes people forgetful. but I didn't forget. I remembered how after my surgery she helped me shower, never with awkwardness or complaint. She sang softly like a lullaby only meant for me. I remembered her guiding my hand to the rail when I walked down the stairs for the first time after the fall. I remembered her handwriting firm, deliberate, as she filled in hospital forms, always putting next of kin aunt, like it was her birthright. And maybe it was. Because if kinship is measured by proximity, by duty, by love, then she was more daughter than anyone else in this family had ever been to me. Once I dropped a teacup. I was trying to dry it, and it slipped from my hands. It shattered across the kitchen floor. I stood there, frozen, humiliated, frustrated by my aging body. Before I could bend down, she was already there, sweeping up the pieces, humming the same tune she always did when cleaning low and slow like something old and safe. When she stood up, she touched my shoulder gently and said, "We can always replace a cup, but there's only one of you." And I broke. Not loudly, not with sobs, but with that ache that starts in the chest and settles behind the eyes. I turned away so she wouldn't see, but she did. Of course she did. She always saw. Not just messes or tasks, but me. The me beneath the routine, beneath the matriarch, beneath the strong elder persona I wore like armor. She never called me weak. She never made me feel obsolete. And in return I gave her scraps of what she truly deserved, until now. I began to ask myself, when did help become invisible? When did we decide that the one who makes life easier should be paid in silence and spare change? My other children, they come when it suits them. Bring flowers for Mother's Day, post photos online with captions like, "Love you, Mom," and leave their dirty laundry behind on weekends. But her love wasn't seasonal. It wasn't posted. It wasn't posed. It was constant, daily, lived. And what did she ever ask for in return? Nothing, not once. Even when her shoes started to tear at the seams, she stitched them herself. Even when she caught a cold from walking in the rain, to pick up my prescription, she insisted she was just tired. Even when the children mocked her accent, saying it was too slow, she never told me. I only found out because I overheard them. And when I asked her why she never said anything, she just smiled and said, "They're young. They'll learn." But they wouldn't unless someone taught them. Unless someone showed them what love truly looked like and what happens when it's ignored. So I started writing her name not just in my heart, where it had always lived, but in ink, on paper, in the places where the future was being decided. On the will, I didn't just leave her the house. I added a note. Because love is earned not through birthright, but through care. I gave her my jewelry, the family heirlooms she'd polished year after year but never worn. I gave her the savings I had tucked away, just in case, because she was my just in case. She was my plan B, my safety net, my miracle. I gave her the power of attorney. I gave her recognition. And more than that, I gave her permanence. They say love is in the details. Well, her hands held all the details of my life. Now it's time they hold the future too. He was younger than I expected. Mid-40s maybe, with a polite voice and eyes that scanned documents too quickly. I had brought my old will in a large manila envelope, edges frayed from years of sitting untouched in the back of my drawer. As I laid it out on the table, he nodded, put on his glasses, and began to read. The office smelled of paper and faint cologne. The kind of place built for decisions. People don't like to talk about decisions dressed up in neat fonts and notarized pages. "I just want to make some changes," I told him. "Of course," he said. "We can go through each section." And so we did. My children's names were listed in their tidy blocks, equal shares of the house, the land, the savings. It looked so organized, so fair. But I felt nothing reading it. just a strange sense of detachment, like I was reading someone else's story, someone else's legacy. Because what looked like fairness on paper had become cruelty in practice. They had all the appearances of loving children, but not the heart of it. They had stopped seeing me as someone to cherish and had started seeing me as someone to manage. And her, the one who had cared for me daily, her name wasn't there at all. Actually, I said, tapping the page, I'd like to remove these names from the primary assets. The lawyer paused, his pen hovering. All of them. Yes, I said firmly, and add someone else. He didn't ask why. Lawyers rarely do. They assume the story behind the ink is private, painful, or both. But as he began redrafting the document, I felt something shift inside me. Not a jolt, but a slow, steady settling, like furniture finally being placed where it always belonged. When he asked for the beneficiary's full name, I gave it to him, my niece. Her name looked strange in print at first, like a new note in a familiar melody. But it felt right, more than right. It felt like justice. Would you like to include a statement of intent? He asked, tilting his head. I thought for a moment. Yes, I said. Make it clear. This isn't a gift. It's recognition. He nodded and typed. This decision reflects the consistent care, devotion, and presence of the beneficiary, whose love and loyalty have sustained me when others offered only distance. I let the words sit on the screen for a moment. Then I added, she is not my obligation. She is my choice. He smiled faintly. That's beautifully said. I didn't feel beautiful, though. I felt tired. Not physically, but soul tired, from the weight of years spent pretending everything was okay, the weight of choosing harmony over truth, silence over confrontation. But this act of revision, it was my way of reclaiming that truth. Not loudly, not vindictively, just quietly and with finality. He printed the draft, slid it across the table, and handed me a pen. Take your time, he said. I didn't need time. I signed it in steady strokes. As I wrote my name, I thought of her sitting at home, probably folding laundry or refilling the rice canister without being asked. I thought of all the times she stepped aside so the rest of the family could shine. I thought of her sleeping on the couch when the grandkids stayed over, never complaining. I thought of her slipping extra ginger into my tea when my stomach hurt, or the way she rubbed my feet when they swelled. She would never ask for anything, so I had to give it without being asked. And this time I would not apologize. The lawyer handed me a copy for my records and stood to shake my hand. It's rare, he said, to see someone do something so deliberate, so clear-eyed. It shouldn't be rare, I replied. Kindness shouldn't be punished, and care shouldn't be invisible. As I stepped out of the office and into the sunlight, I felt something leave me like a long-held breath, finally exhaled. The air felt cleaner. The weight I'd carried for years had shifted, no longer strapped to my back, but trailing behind me like an old coat I'd finally shrugged off. I took a bus home. The city outside the window passed in soft blurs. Trees, storefronts, people moving quickly with their own burdens. But I moved slowly, intentionally, like someone who had made peace with her decision and was ready to walk into the rest of her days unashamed. When I got home, she was at the sink peeling sweet potatoes for dinner. She looked up and smiled, wiping her hands on a towel. Long day, she asked. Not too long, I said, setting down my bag, but it was important. She nodded, not asking for more. That was her way, never intruding, never assuming. But one day she would open an envelope. One day after I'm gone, she would read those pages and understand fully what she'd meant to me. Not in gestures, not in shared tea and silent comfort, but in ink, in law, in legacy. They would read it too. And maybe they'd finally see what they refused to acknowledge. That love, when ignored, doesn't disappear. It simply redirects. And I had redirected mine to the only one who ever stayed. It was a Sunday lunch, one of those gatherings they insisted on having for family time, though they rarely looked up from their phones long enough to notice who was there. The weather was warm sunlight streaming through the dining room window in streaks of gold and dust. I had cooked all morning braised pork caramelized fish, a pot of soup simmering gently, and as usual she helped. She always did. Her hands moved instinctively now as if my kitchen were an extension of her body. She knew where every ladle lived. Every spice jar rested. We moved around each other like dancers who had long ago learned the steps. When everyone arrived, they brought their noise with them. Grandchildren burst through the door first, followed by the clipped voices of my daughter and daughter-in-law, both already discussing which of them would host Christmas, though it was months away. My son walked in behind them balancing his phone and a take-out coffee, only half acknowledging me with a distracted kiss on the cheek. She came out of the kitchen, last hands wiped, clean hair pinned back neatly. I watched her pause near the dining room entrance, waiting for someone to notice her, to offer that smallest of gestures, a place at the table. No one did. There were 8 chairs around the table, 7 people seated, and no chair left for her. I looked at my daughter, who was already unfolding her napkin. "Could someone bring another chair?" I asked gently but firmly. My daughter-in-law blinked. "Oh, there's no room," she said, glancing around. "We didn't know she was coming." "Didn't know she was coming?" "She lives here. She cooks your meals, cleans your messes, watches your children." I felt something rise in my chest, shame first, then fury. "She made the soup," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp. It sliced through their chatter like a knife through silk. "The soup you're about to eat. She made it. And she's always here. Every day. Every meal." They looked uncomfortable. My son stood slowly. "I'll get a chair," he mumbled. But she had already turned back toward the kitchen. "I'm fine," she said softly. "I'll eat later." I followed her. I found her at the counter ladling a small bowl for herself, pretending to be busy, pretending that it didn't sting. "You don't have to accept this," I said. She smiled gently. "It's not worth making a scene." But it was. It was worth it. Because this wasn't about one chair. It was about the unspoken rule they had created and enforced through omission. She didn't belong. Not fully. Not publicly. She could cook. She could clean. She could support. But she couldn't sit among them. And I knew that if I had left the table, if I had stood up and given her my place, they would have let me. They wouldn't have protested. They would have let me make room for her while they stayed seated in their own comfort, because that's what they had come to expect, that I would rearrange myself so they wouldn't have to. But I didn't leave the table. Instead, I walked back, pulled my chair out, and said loudly, "She's not eating in the kitchen." They all looked up. "If there's no chair for her," I continued, "then there's no meal for anyone." A silence settled over the room like dust after a collapse. For the first time, they looked at me not with affection or deference, but with confusion. Because I had never done that before. I'd never drawn a line. My son stood again this time with more intention. He fetched a chair from the hallway and placed it beside mine. "Here," he said, but the gesture felt hollow. Too late. She joined reluctantly, bowl in her hands, and sat down. She didn't say a word, but her eyes met mine, and there was something in them, a glimmer of something that hadn't been there before. Not gratitude, not surprise. Relief. Because I had finally done what I should have done years ago. I had chosen her. Not privately, not in secret, but publicly where it mattered. They all ate after that, though, with less chatter than usual. Something had shifted. A balance had tipped. Maybe they felt it too, that something in me was no longer passive, that the woman who had quietly kept the peace was no longer willing to do so at the expense of dignity. After they left, the dishes remained untouched. I sat on the porch with her, watching the light fade across the neighbor's roof. "I'm sorry," I said. She looked at me, surprised. For what? For letting it go on so long, for every chair that wasn't set. She shook her head. "You always gave me space." "Not the kind that mattered," I said. "Not the kind they couldn't ignore." That night I rewrote another letter to the lawyer, not because I needed more time to think, but because I wanted to be thorough. I wanted there to be no confusion, no loopholes, no gentle interpretations. I specified dates. I included memories. I gave context. I wanted it to be known this wasn't an act of charity. It was a course correction. Because one day they'll sit at a table again. And maybe, just maybe, they'll remember what it feels like to realize they've left someone out. I've always believed that decisions of the heart should be written down, not just spoken, not whispered in kitchens, or passed as soft assurances in the dark. They need to be recorded, folded, sealed, because paper once signed has weight, and that envelope sitting in the top drawer of my nightstand carried decades of breath I had been holding. I remember the morning I placed the new will inside it. The house was quiet, a kind of quiet you feel more than hear. She had gone to the market early, as she always did on Sundays, her cloth bag slung across her shoulder, her list neatly tucked inside, handwritten in the same careful script she used for everything. I had just finished my tea when I opened the drawer, took the envelope out, and held it between my palms. It was heavier than it should have been, just paper and ink, but in truth, it carried every unspoken moment of her life in this house, every dish she washed, every night she rubbed my feet without being asked, every instant she was passed over, stepped around, forgotten. All of it was there, tucked between those pages, no longer invisible. I stood for a while, the envelope still sealed, my thumb tracing its edge. Part of me feared. It feared the finality of what I had done, because it wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a line drawn in the sand. It was an act they could not ignore, and I knew once they read it, there would be fallout. They would be angry. They would feel betrayed. They would say I'd been manipulated, or that I was going senile. They would try to reduce it to something small, something forgivable, something reversible. But I didn't write this for them. I wrote it for her. When she returned home, she found me in the garden pruning the lemon tree. She offered to help, but I waved her off. "You've done enough for one lifetime," I said. She laughed, not quite sure if I was joking. She never was. Later that evening, as I watched her set the table, this time with her own plate already placed, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, peace. The kind of peace that comes from finally saying what you needed to say, even if only on paper. I thought about the generations before me, how women in my family rarely got to choose. We gave, we yielded, we endured, and we told ourselves that this was noble, that sacrifice was a kind of grace. And perhaps it was. But too often we gave to those who had no idea what it cost us. And those who saw our sacrifice were often the ones asked to wait until the giving was done before they could be acknowledged. She had waited long enough. That night, I placed the envelope back in the drawer along with a letter addressed to her. Handwritten. No legalese, just the truth. I told her how much she had done, not just for me, but for this house. I told her she had earned more than rooms and chores and politeness. She had earned family not in name, but in action. I told her that while others would grumble, she would inherit with a clear conscience and an even clearer truth. She had never been an extra mouth. She had been the hands that fed us all. When I sealed that envelope, I felt a sense of completion, not just for the legal part of things, but for the moral part. I had chosen not to let their noise drown out her silence anymore. I had carved her name into the place where they had only drawn borders. She was no longer waiting outside a closed door. I went to bed early that night, slept deeply, dreamlessly. In the morning, I found her outside, sipping her tea on the porch. The sun was just rising, casting long shadows across the floorboards. "Morning," she said. "Morning," I replied, sitting beside her. We didn't talk about the envelope. We didn't need to, because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of what the future would bring. I had done what was right, not what was easy. I had chosen not to be soft, but to be firm in my love, not loud, but clear. And that envelope sealed and waiting wasn't just a document. It was a promise made visible. It's always in the eyes, you know. The things people don't say out loud, they still speak just differently. I used to tell myself that they were just tired, just distracted, that their glances weren't meant to sting. But after a while, the pattern became too sharp to ignore. It wasn't just absence of warmth. It was presence of something colder. Contempt, perhaps, or maybe irritation that never got loud enough to call out, but stayed in the air like the smell of something left to burn. When she entered a room, their posture changed. My daughter would suddenly check her phone. My son would stop mid-sentence, as if her very presence disrupted the thread of his thought. My daughter-in-law would offer a thin-lipped smile, never quite touching her eyes, then turn away too quickly. And the grandchildren, oh, they were the worst, but only because they were honest. Children, after all, mirror what they see. And what they had seen was a house that treated her as background noise. They interrupted her when she spoke, cut her off with the ease of someone used to being heard over someone used to being dismissed. She laughed at their jokes, but they never laughed at hers. They never asked her how her day was, never said thank you. And if she lingered too long in conversation, I'd catch one of them glancing at the clock, as if her words were wasting precious time. She noticed it all. I know she did, but she never let it show. She had this way of absorbing the cold without letting it harden her. Her smile remained gentle, even when their silence screamed louder than words. And I, God help me, I let it go on. For years I excused it as generational difference, as busy lives, as fatigue. But none of that justifies cruelty dressed in civility. I remember one dinner just a few months before I rewrote the will, when she reached for the soy sauce, and my granddaughter, barely 13, rolled her eyes and said, "Don't use too much. There won't be enough for everyone." The entire table laughed, even my daughter, and she has always smiled and pulled her hand back. I remember gripping my fork so tightly that my knuckles went white. But I didn't say anything. I let the moment pass, just like all the others. But it stayed with me, like the time she offered to hold the baby, and my daughter-in-law said, "Maybe later when she's clean." Like the time she brought home pastries from the market, and no one touched them until she wasn't looking. Like the time they talked about booking a family vacation right in front of her, listing names, planning logistics, while she stood there, silently pouring tea. How many times can a person be told they are not wanted without a single word being spoken? The truth is, she didn't need to be screamed at to feel small. They had perfected the art of erasure. They excluded her with practiced ease, like someone removing a jacket when the room gets too warm. But she kept showing up. She still woke early to clean, still stayed up late to finish the dishes they left behind. She still remembered birthdays, still left little notes on the fridge with smiley faces and reminders to wear a jacket when it rained. She still tried, even when they didn't deserve it. And perhaps that's what bothered them most, that she loved despite being ignored, that her grace made their indifference more visible, that she made no demands and yet somehow still threatened their comfort, because if love is earned, she had earned more than any of them, and they knew it, even if they'd never say it. There was a time when I would have tried to justify them, to say they didn't know better, that they were too absorbed in their own lives. But now I understand neglect is a choice too, and after enough choices it becomes character. They looked at her like she didn't matter. And one day soon they would look at a sealed envelope and realize just how much she did. I imagine that moment often, them sitting together after I'm gone opening the will, their faces shifting as they read. Disbelief first, then offense, then the scramble to rewrite history in their favor. She manipulated her. She must have changed it behind our backs. This isn't fair. But what is fair really? Is it fair to share my wealth with those who only came around when it served them? Is it fair to leave behind gratitude for people who never said thank you? Is it fair to reward presents on holidays over presents on hospital nights? I don't think so. Fair is not equal. Fair is earned. And she earned every word of that document, not through blood, but through bone, through long hours, and soft songs and silent loyalty, through every time she swallowed their indifference and still showed up. So yes, they looked at her like she didn't matter. But I saw it got there. And one day they will too, though not in time to stop what's already been signed and sealed. There's a particular ache in holding your tongue for too long. It doesn't just sit in your mouth. It finds its way into your chest, coils around your ribs, and settles beneath your heart like a stone. I carried that weight for years. All the things I wanted to say, but didn't. All the defenses I could have spoken on her behalf and chose instead to swallow, because I thought that peace was more important than truth. That silence was a kind of wisdom. That restraint would somehow teach them grace. But silence didn't make them kinder. It made them bolder. I never told them how much it hurt me to see her left out of photos, how they always called her to take the picture, never asking her to be in it. I never told them how I noticed she was the only one cleaning up after birthday parties, how she picked up the wrapping paper and washed the frosting streaked plates, while the rest of them laughed in the living room. I never told them how it made me wince to hear them say things like, "She's lucky to have you," as if she were some stray dog I'd rescued, and not a full human being who had given her youth to this family. There were so many times I bit my tongue until it ached, so many moments I could have drawn a line and didn't. Like when my daughter made her redo the table settings because they weren't symmetrical, or when my son raised his voice because she forgot to plug in his phone charger. Little things, but little things add up, one drop at a time until the cup spills. And through all of it, she never once asked me to defend her. I think that's what broke me most, that she accepted her place in their hierarchy so completely, that she internalized their lack of acknowledgement as something she had to endure rather than challenge. I'd look at her sometimes standing off to the side during family dinners, quietly laughing at jokes she wasn't invited into, and I'd wonder, had I taught her to do that? Had my silence been her example? Because I had always spoken up for others, at church, at work, for my children when they were young. But when it came to her, I let the lines blur. I thought I was protecting her by not rocking the boat. But in truth, I was protecting them. I was shielding them from the discomfort of being called out. And in doing so, I left her to carry their indifference alone. There was one evening not long ago when we were watching an old film together, one of those sentimental ones, full of sweeping music and soft dialogue. A grandmother figure on screen said something like, "You were never invisible to me." And without even turning her head, she whispered, "That must be nice." It wasn't a jab, just a thought, but it hit me like a blow to the chest. I wanted to say everything right then. I wanted to say you were never invisible to me either. I wanted to say I see you. I've always seen you. I just didn't know how to show it loud enough to drown out their silence. But I didn't. I just reached over and held her hand. And that night I wrote her a letter. Not a legal one, not a declaration of wealth or estate, just words, my words, the ones I never said out loud. I told her I remembered the time she stayed up with me through the storm reading from her book so I wouldn't feel alone. I told her I remembered the way she packed my pills for travel, lining them up in little cases labeled with tiny sticky notes. I told her that she was the reason this house had felt like home for so long, that it wasn't the walls or the photographs or the furniture. It was her. And I ended that letter with the words, "I should have spoken years ago, I love you. I'm proud of you. And I'm sorry I didn't say it more often." I left it in my drawer beside the will, because one day they'll read the paperwork, the asset lists, the distribution lines. But she will read the truth. And maybe that's what matters most, that she knows I didn't just see her in action, but in soul, that she wasn't just the one who helped, she was the one who healed, the one who stayed. Now when I walk past her in the hall or hand her a bowl of tea, I sometimes think of all those unsaid things, but I no longer carry the guilt of them, because the silence is over. The papers have been signed, the lines have been drawn. And while I may not have shouted her worth to the world, I wrote it in every line of my legacy. They may never know the things I never said, but she will. And that is enough. They didn't expect me to change anything. That much was clear. They thought I would die as I had lived with grace, with tolerance, with a tendency to smile through disappointments like a mother should. They counted on the fact that I hated conflict, that I would rather patch things up with quiet gestures than confront anyone with ugly truths. They mistook my stillness for surrender, my gentleness for helplessness. But they forgot something. I may be soft-spoken, but I am not powerless. My voice may not echo, but my choices carry weight. They didn't notice the shift at first. I didn't announce it. There were no fights, no dramatic declarations, just small actions. I stopped reminding them of family dinners. I stopped rushing to mediate their arguments. I let them show themselves to each other without my interference. And in the silence they became louder, more dismissive, more entitled. They believed I was growing tired, frail, maybe even forgetful. They were wrong. I was watching. Every rolled eye, every backhanded comment, every missed thank you, every time they passed her by like she was furniture. I noticed, and I recorded it not on paper, but in memory. Because one day when they looked to me for reward, I would look to those moments for reckoning. The final straw wasn't a dramatic betrayal. It was something small. It always is. I had asked them all to come early, to help prepare for Tet, our most sacred family celebration. They arrived late, one by one, with excuses and bags of store-bought food they hadn't even tried to present with care. She, on the other hand, had spent 3 days preparing the altar flowers, steaming the ban chung, ironing my red ao dye for the morning prayers. When they arrived, she opened the door. My grandson said, "Oh, you're still here." Still here, as if she were a temporary fixture, a stain they assumed would fade with time. I watched from the living room as her smile faltered for half a second, just enough to see the bruise of those words before she covered it up. And I realized they truly believed she would never leave because she had nowhere else to go. They were wrong again. She had me. That night, after everyone had gone, I sat her down and told her everything. About the will, about the changes, about the words I had sealed in that envelope next to my bed. Her eyes welled, but no tears fell. She simply sat there, still as ever, as if afraid to believe what she'd heard. "You don't have to do all this," she said. "But I want to," I replied. "They'll be upset." "Yes," I said, "they will." She looked down. "They'll say I tricked you." "They'll say whatever helps them sleep at night," I said. "But I know what I'm doing, and so do you." For a long moment she was quiet. Then she whispered, "Thank you." I shook my head. "Don't thank me. You earned this. I'm just putting on paper what you've already lived." And that was the truth. I wasn't rewarding her. I wasn't being noble. I was simply correcting a wrong that had gone on for too long. When I think back now, I see the years of her effort, stacked in quiet layers, an unacknowledged tower of devotion. They thought their presence at holidays entitled them to a legacy. But what is legacy if not who carries you through your worst days? She carried me, not with grand gestures, but in the quiet ways that stay with you, the soft closing of a door, the warm bowl of soup brought at just the right hour, the silent presence beside me during doctor's visits, the way she never interrupted even when she should have. And they thought they were entitled to more. No. They thought I was too old to change the path I had set, that I would never undo what tradition had dictated, that I'd never go so far as to leave everything to the one they considered nothing. But I did. And the beauty of it, I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to slam a door or curse their names. All I needed to do was choose. They counted on my silence, so I wrote my answer down instead. And when the time comes, they will read it not from my lips, but from the lines of legal clarity and loving finality. And she will stand not with shame, but with the quiet pride of someone finally seen. Because silence may endure for a time, but real love always finds a way to speak. The day I told them I didn't shout, there were no fireworks, no arguments, just the quiet sound of my voice and the even quieter sound of their assumptions shattering. I invited them over on a Sunday, not for a meal, not for a holiday, just a gathering. I didn't tell them why. I simply said I had something important to share. They came, of course. Curiosity always moves them faster than love. They arrived with their usual rhythm shoes kicked off lazily at the door. Children running wild through the hallway, greetings tossed my way like loose change. She was there too, standing near the doorway, unsure whether she should stay or go. I gave her a seat beside me at the head of the table. That was the first sign. My son raised an eyebrow. My daughter looked briefly confused, but neither said anything. I waited until the noise settled, until the children had been ushered out into the garden, until only the adults sat before me, those who thought they knew what came next. "I've updated my will," I said simply. The room went still. My daughter gave a soft laugh the kind people make when they feel a storm on the horizon. "Oh, Mom, is this about taxes again? We've told you." "No," I said, "this isn't about taxes." I reached into my bag and placed a copy of the updated will on the table, neatly stapled, signed, sealed. My estate. I continued everything I have this home, the savings, the land. It's all going to her. I didn't look at anyone but her when I said it. Her face didn't move. She froze not in shock, but in the way someone does when they're too used to not being believed. It was my son who spoke first. "You're kidding." I shook my head. "No." My daughter leaned forward, her voice brittle. "Mom, you can't be serious. She's not family." I looked at her then, calm, steady. She's more family than anyone else at this table. And that's when the volume rose. Accusations, thinly veiled insults, words like manipulation and betrayal. My son accused her of playing the long game of winning my affection with chores and fake humility. My daughter claimed I was being taken advantage of. My daughter-in-law said she always knew something was off. She sat in silence through all of it, her hands in her lap, eyes down, not flinching, not defending. I let them speak, and when they ran out of breath, when the silence finally came back into the room like a wave receding, I spoke again. For years, I said she's been the one holding this family together. She's the one who cleaned your dishes, raised your children, nursed me through illness, and never once asked for anything. She never expected this, but I chose it, and that's what matters. "You're punishing us," my son muttered. "No," I said. "You punished yourselves, with your neglect, with your condescension, with every chair you didn't pull out, every thank you. You didn't say every birthday you ignored. I asked for respect for her, and you gave me silence." The room was quiet again, but now it held weight, dense and uncomfortable. "I'm not doing this to hurt you," I said. "I'm doing it to make things right." My daughter looked at me, eyes sharp. "You'll regret this." I smiled, not cruelly, just truthfully. "No, I'll sleep better than I have in years." She stood up and left first. My son followed, muttering something under his breath. My daughter-in-law gathered the children quickly, her face tight with fury. Only she remained sitting beside me, still not sure whether to believe it was real. When the door finally closed and the house went quiet again, she turned to me. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "Yes, I said I did." She shook her head. "They'll never forgive me." "They don't have to," I said gently. "They'll have to forgive themselves." We sat like that for a long time, the late afternoon sun slanting across the room, catching the dust in golden threads. I looked at her hands, those hands that had held me steady for years, and I thought of how many lives they'd quietly kept afloat. "I just want to be useful," she said. "You've been more than that," I said. "You've been just." And that was the word I kept returning to: justice. Not revenge, not bitterness, just the balance of things finally tilting toward fairness, toward truth, toward someone who had never once asked to be repaid, but had earned everything. Justice without noise. They will tell stories after I'm gone. They'll rewrite the truth to fit their narrative. But she will know. She will carry the real story. And that's all I need. Because I didn't need to raise my voice. I just needed to remember my worth. And hers. The house feels quieter now, not because it's empty, but because it's finally at peace. The kind of peace that doesn't beg for approval or chase after apology. It simply rests like a deep breath after too many held in. She moves through the rooms the same way she always has, but there's a difference now. She doesn't flinch when laughter erupts from the street. She doesn't look over her shoulder when she places her plate at the table. There's no hesitation in her steps, no question in her belonging. I watch her sometimes from my favorite chair, the one by the window where the light lands in the late afternoon. She doesn't know I'm watching, but I am. I see her humming softly as she folds towels, talking to the plants like they're old friends. There is no guilt in her movements now, no shame, just quiet ownership. She never needed my permission. She just needed my recognition. And now she has it in paper and legacy in every corner of this home that finally sees her. I don't think there's a single moment that defines a life. But I do think there are choices, small ones, private ones, that echo long after we're gone. This was mine. Some endings are just beginnings with the noise turned off. I gave them silence, and in it I found peace.